Welcome back. I'm Cody Henriksen. Today we're going to take a look at how we can enhance our Java art project so we can work with a JSlider so we can control the size and the scale, so we can control the amount of edges as well as the scale or size of the shapes we're drawing as part of it. So we have a couple things we want to work with in here. Again, all the work we're talking about right here is in the main part of our project, the art panel, which is a subclass of JPanel. Before we actually get into the code though, we want to make sure we take a look at what we see inside our import statement because we have some stuff we have to add to make the JSlider work properly. The first one we have, which is not part of JavaX, is the java.util.hash table because we need to use a hash table to properly load the information we're going to be storing that will be displayed inside those JSliders. Since we're using a JPanel and we have a whole bunch of other buttons and stuff that are happening inside it, we've already done the import for javax.swing.asterisk because we want to get access to everything that's inside Swing. Great, wonderful. That only gets that level though at javax.swing. It doesn't get the deep level stuff, so I have to go and also do two more imports right there with javax.swing.event.changeEvent and javax.swing.event.changeListener. And that's the listener interface that allows us to actually tell the slider to do something. It listens for that event and then does the actual change event action. I know, crazy. But that's what we're going to be working for with that. So that's what those are up there for. So the first thing, of course, we have to add when we're working the slider are those imports. Again, like I said, we're working inside our art panel class, and our art panel is a subclass of JPanel because we're going to do everything inside that. And again, it's working on the idea of composition. I make the thing that can do the job well, and then I go from there. And so the first thing we want to take a look at right here is we have our data members that are going to be used with this. And so we have a couple ints we have to work with as well as the J components we're talking about for that. And so we have our private final int minimum edge, minimum scale, and maximum scale. And that's going to tell us how much data is stored in between the slider itself. And so I'm saying my minimum edge is 5, my max edge is 20, because once you get past 20 on a really quick app like this, you can't really tell the difference of that and it looks really circular anyway. And then that minimum scale, maximum scale, we have 20 to 100, which is the scaling factor of how big we're going to affect when we draw this lovely shape on our canvas. And that's what those are going to be attached to. And we use the slider to change the values in between that, which is what a slider is done for. Great. We also have to add a couple local variables. So we have a private int current edge count and current scale to store those values because the actual ranges right there, those are the fixed values that are created once, not changed ever, but referenced a couple times inside our code. And then we have the current one, which is where the slider happens to exist. And we want to have that extract out to be a variable rather than having to have the other part of our code know exactly what the name of the variable or the GUI components are, so we can make it so a little bit easier to work with. So that's why we have those ones set up right there. We go down into our data member section right here a little bit further, and we see we have a JPanel slider panel and then two JSliders. The JPanel slider panel is what I'm using to actually hold the structure together. I'm putting the panels together, I'm putting the sliders together, in their own little panel. And it makes it so we can handle the layout a lot nicer and so we can work with that. And then of course I have a JSlider for scale slider and another JSlider for the edge slider. And so those are the data members we're working with right here. We go ahead and we go down to our constructor really fast. Now, before we go down to our constructor, notice that on these constants right here, notice that are constants, of course, by the caps lock and the snake case we're working with on that we have those initialized immediately because when we're using a constant, we want it to be defined before we even try and possibly reference it later on inside our code. So I have those constants declared in my declaration section. It's only because they're constants I'm doing that. And otherwise, I wouldn't even think about putting a value or an equal sign in my declaration section. That's for the constructor to do. But because it's a constant, I want to make sure it's explicitly called out right there. So let's go to our constructor really fast. And inside our constructor, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have the values that go along with that. And of course, we have our call to super. And then we have the initialization of the values that we're working with on that. And that's right here in that little section right there. And so you have that current scale as a minimum scale. My current edge count is set to minimum edge. So I assign the default value to be the smallest possible value. Just a nice little policy right there. And then I initialize my sliders using those constants again. And so a new JSlider passing at minimum scale and maximum scale for scale slider, and edge sliders pass minimum edge and maximum edge, which defines how wide that scale value is, regardless of how big the actual screen is. It's like, here's the max and here's the min. It automatically has that fixed for it. Then we're just going to go ahead and we have a slider panel with that. The next thing we have right here is we have our slider panel, which is the panel I'm holding those sliders in to make my layout a lot easier. We've seen that when we're doing some of those more complex layouts, we have to have a constraint for every single piece. And I don't want to do that. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to make a lovely grid layout for that. And so I put it in there. And so I have as many rows as I need with only one column. And that's what that 0, 1 parameter right here says, is I'm going to have, if I hover over, I can see it really quick right here. So rows and cols. So I have an unspecified number of rows, but I have only one column. So I have a slider and then another slider stacked right on top of it because I have 2 rows in this case because I'm only putting 2 things in and as many columns as I need. And so that's what we're working for with that. And so that's our constructor taken care of. We've initialized all of our values, we've initialized the panel itself, and then we're going to go ahead and put this next piece together. So that's what we're going to do first. So collapse that out of the way. And the next thing we have is, of course, we have our setup sliders method. excuse me. Our setup sliders method is a helper method we're going to use that we can actually load the information up into our slider. We use the setup sliders method to set it up first because there's a lot of work that goes into working with a JSlider. And so we have a helper method that can handle that. And we want to make sure we do that before we even get into setup panel. And so we'll go ahead and take a look at that really fast. And so in our setup sliders method, as you can see right here, the first thing we have is we're making two hash tables. We saw that import a minute ago where we're actually going to make the hash table for it. And so a hash table, again, is a key value storage system. In this case, it's based off of an integer and a J label. So every single number we put in there has an associated J label attached to it. And so we have scale labels and edge labels, and they're a new hash table of integer J label each. And then we're going to take advantage of the fact that I can use inside any of the J components, I can use HTML or even CSS styling to make it look a little bit nicer. And so I'm going to do scale labels.put and make an anonymous instance of a hash table value right here of the JLabel integer combo. And it's going to put maximum scale plus minimum scale divided by 2. So I'm going to get that middle-ish amount. And I'm going to put that inside there. And I'm going to make a new label of a new medium shape using the HTML and then BR tag on there to make sure it says, oh, it's a medium, and then below it shape using that style for that. And then minimum scale is a small shape with a small and then shape below it. And then a maximum scale with a large shape. Yeah, I know, cheesy. And because I'm using a hash table, these values, it doesn't matter what order I put them in because it's going to be referenced to me, automatically by looking at the value that's inside that integer. And that integer value will be referenced back to the actual slider itself as to where to place them on the actual layout. I know, pretty cool. Do the same thing again for the edge labels. Same basic approach, but I'm just posting the minimum edge and maximum edge on that one. And then here's where the work really comes into play. When we're talking about a scale slider, we want to tell it how we want it to look. And so I definitely want to make a label table for it. So I use the set label table and that J label table I just made a minute ago using a hash table and install that right there. And of course, I'm going to set that to be paint labels to be true so I can actually see it. I also want to decide, do I want the orientation of that slider to go up and down or left to right? And that's handled with the JSlider.vertical value right here or JSlider.horizontal. So if I have it vertical, it's going up and down. If I have it horizontal, it's going left to right. Easy peasy, no worries. I do want to set snap to ticks by default to be true because I want to like, oh, that's where it's going to. So I'm clicking on the value, and it's a nice way to visually identify where that's headed. Major tick spacing and minor tick spacing depends on the values we're working with. And so as you can see right here on my scale slider, I have that major tick spacing to 10, but my edge slider I have my major tick spacing to 3 or 5 or something like that. And so when I'm working with that is when I have a big range of values, I want those major ticks, the big lines on a, say for example, ruler, I want those to be spaced farther apart. But if I'm looking for a small range of value, I want those to be closer together so I can actually see where the discrepancy is, not discrepancy, but see the distinction between the values. And if I want to even have the minor ticks painted, I don't have it on my scale slider up here, but I do definitely have it on that edge slider where I definitely want to see that more discrete value painted on there. So that's why I have those set for that right there. Finally, I set the minimum set value. In this case, I put minimum scale, so it automatically slides it to the very middle bottom of that for it to go. And that puts it there right there. So that puts together the actual slider method itself. That setup sliders method I call inside my constructor right here before I even call setup panel. And so that way I can do all the setup work I need to actually use that slider and have it available for me. Finally, let's go ahead and let's take a look at the setup panel, how I'm going to work with that inside the system. And so in the setup panel for this, I just say slider panel set preferred size. In this case, I'm giving it a new dimension of 250 by 450. And I'm going to put my scale slider and my edge slider in there. So it's like, oh, I'm going to stack it in there, boom, boom. And I'm going to put those two sliders inside that panel. And then I add that panel itself to the panel I'm working with. So that's why I have the this.add slider panel. And that makes it so instead of having to do constraints for every single button that I have inside here for the art project or the sliders themselves, I only have to do the constraints for those two panels worth of information. And it makes it so it looks so much nicer and easier to organize and structure my code around. And that's handled inside my setup layout, which we're not going to talk about right now because that's just the GUI placement of it and how I'm going to put it on the side of the window. Take a look at the layout video and you can see how I can work with that as well. Finally, the last thing we have to do is how can we make it so sliders actually do something? That's going to be handled inside my setup listeners method. And again, just like always, I call setup listeners at the bottom of my constructor. Right here, setup layout and setup listeners, I call it so I can actually attach listeners to each of those GUI components. So I'm going to scroll down here, go down to setup listeners. And inside my setup listeners, you can see I have a listener for my slider and my edge slider. I'm just going to pick on one of them right now because it's the same thing for both, just slightly different. And so what we have right here inside my scale slider, I have an add change listener. So instead of using a action listener like we've used with our buttons, or J text fields, or hey, even a J combo box, because it's just a simple action to click. Instead, we're looking for a change listener because we're looking for an active change. It's a bit more complex. So, but it has the same basic structure. We have a required public method. In this case, it's state changed. It takes a change event as its parameter, and the variable name, since we're not using it all, doesn't really matter. So I just named it event because it's easy and it's cheap. Then what we want to do is we want to make sure that we're only going to call that state changed if we're done moving. We don't want this to be randomly firing all over the place. So instead, when the state changed, I first examine it. Hey, am I moving right now? If I'm not, then I'll actually grab the value. And if I am moving, I just ignore it. And just the action is skipped. And then I just assign the current scale or the current edge to be the appropriate value out of that slider. And that way I can use that information to retrieve the value that's working within that slider, and I can use that to do some cool stuff and do things within there. In this case, change the size and the scale of the pictures we're drawing inside our screen. I hope this is helpful. Cheers and have a great day. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.